Thank you. And I have the pleasure of having you right after lunch, so this should be fun. But I'm delighted to be here to speak with you this afternoon, thinking, or should I say rethinking about stewardship together. So what I intend to do in about 18 and a half minutes is share two examples with you of stewardship. And I hope these case studies of sorts will give us some fodder for our thinking later this afternoon. But before I turn to these examples, I think I owe you an explanation for the title of my talk, You Can't Beat God's Giving. Some of you might be familiar with this song. I will not sing it for you, but although that would be one way of keeping you awake, that would also be a form of torture. It is often sung as an offertory hymn, this song, You Can't Beat God's Giving. There's something about being in this space that makes me feel confessional. So I will tell you that when I was asked to speak on this topic, this is what came to mind for me. I'm going to share some of the lyrics with you. It states, you can't beat God's giving no matter how you try. The more you give, the more God gives to you. Just keep on giving because God's word is true. You can't beat God's giving, no matter how you try. And so I think it was interesting that when I was asked about this topic, that the first thing I thought of was not in terms of the church. It was in terms of what God has done for us. And of course, this observation begs that question, what is it that God has given us? And we don't need to look very far in the biblical text to figure that out, right? God has given us the natural world, the stars and the moon and the sun, the ocean, the trees and the mountains. God has given us animals. But perhaps what I'll be focusing on most today is that God has given us each other. And that's pretty hard to beat. So I think the lyrics of the song is true. God has also given us spirit. And it is through spirit that we experience grace and love and mercy. And this song reminds me, and hopefully you as well, that as we begin to investigate stewardship, that we must examine it from at least these two perspectives, right? What we give to each other and what it is that we do with what God has given to us. And so with that, I'll turn to my first case study, if you will. I'm a New Testament scholar by training, and so I go all the way to the first century, and I take you to the making of the first Christian church. We find this in the book of Acts. Most scholars agree that this book is a continuation of the Gospel of Luke, and we also view it as a church history of sorts. So if you like narratives and epic tales, this is the New Testament text for you. The main question that this text answers is, how did a small group of Jesus followers grow into what we come to know as the church? And a secondary question might be, and how did those who participated in this movement become a community? Well, in Acts 1:15, it tells us that in those days, Peter stood among the believers, the brothers and the sisters, together. The crowd numbered around 120 people, so that's even smaller than Odin, Minnesota, right? 120 people. And then the day of Pentecost comes, and on that day, we find out that they were all together in one place. The writer of Acts tends to emphasize this unity of the group of believers. This togetherness is an important characteristic of this community. And it's here in chapter 2 that Peter gives a speech or a sermon, if you will, and the church grows. I mean, exponential growth, right? It says in the text that those who welcomed his message were baptized, and on that day, 3,000 people were added. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayers. Now, that must have been some good preaching, right? to grow from 120 to 3,000. But I think there's clearly something else going on here besides Peter's preaching. It's about the community. The community described here is devoted to fellowship. So that means they hung out together. They broke bread. That means they ate together. And they prayed. So they sought divine guidance together. Life among the believers is described in this way, just a couple of verses later in Acts 2:43. It says that all came upon everyone because many signs and wonders were being done by the apostles. All who believed were together. See, there's that togetherness again. And they had all things in common. But here's the kicker. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all, as any had need. Day by day, they spent much time together. You can fill in the blank here, right? They broke bread from home to home, and they ate their food. Food must have been important to this community. And they did so with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having the goodwill of all the people. And day by day, the Lord added to their numbers. I think this sounds like some sort of leftist utopian society, some socialist community, I don't know. But I also think it would be pretty great to be a part of this community. No one in the community lacked for anything. People were kind and giving. The leaders, they performed signs and wonders, and we can talk about what that might look like in our context. But more importantly, the community spent time together. They trusted each other. I think it's important to note that other ancient texts describe friendship using this same kind of language. We see that in philosophical groups and other religious groups, in Plato and Philo and Seneca, for example. So what we can really say about the early church is that these folks were friends. I mentioned to my mom that I was going to talk about this text, and she quickly reminded me, well, you know, that was the first century. And the reason that they sold all their possessions was because they thought Jesus' return was imminent. She raises a good point, and perhaps the thought of Jesus coming at any moment might influence our behavior, but I do wonder how we, in this day and age, can create conditions that enable people to feel similarly invested in our churches. Now, there's more to say about this community of believers. Acts tells us later on in chapter 4 that this whole group of believers were of one heart and soul. No one claimed private ownership of any possessions, but everything they owned was held in common. With great power, the apostles gave their testimony, so they preached about the resurrection of the Lord, and there was not a needy person among them. We then see a very quick story, just 2 verses, about a Levite. We heard about a Levite this morning, right? Dr. Reed talked about a Levite, which is why this indication of his heritage becomes important. He's from Cyprus. His name is Joseph. For some reason, they call him Barnabas. I'm not sure. But he sells a field that belonged to him, and he brings all the possessions, the money from the proceeds of the sale, and lays it at the feet of the apostles. So that money is donated and laid at the feet of the apostles suggests that they are the ones who have authority over the community. They are the leaders, but they're also the recipients of power and grace given to them by the Holy Spirit. It should not be taken lightly that they also had the responsibility to distribute what was needed to those who were lacking. This description of community ends with this example of Joseph, but then is followed very quickly by a much longer story of Ananias and Sapphira. Anybody familiar with their story? I know. I can't talk about one without talking about the other. So just very briefly, I'll remind you who have heard the story and introduce to those of you who have not the story of Ananias and Sapphira. They were a married couple. They decided perhaps that they wanted to be a part of this community, so they sold their land. But between the two of them, they made an agreement. that they would only bring a portion of the proceeds to the apostles. And so Ananias goes to Peter, and he lays the proceeds at his feet, and Peter asks him, basically, is this all you have? And he says it is. And Peter declares that he has lied to us, but more importantly, he has lied to God. And Ananias falls dead, right there, on the spot. He's carried out and buried. 3 hours later, I guess his wife is wondering what happened to him. She goes looking for him, and she goes to the church. This is long before social media, right? Because otherwise she might have gotten an update that her husband had died. And Peter asked her, so what is the price that you received for the land? And she responds in the same way that Ananias had. And Peter says, how is it that you have agreed together, right, to put the Holy Spirit to the test? She falls down, dies at his feet instantly, and is buried next to her husband. See, I've always found this story a little troubling on many levels. So while I do understand that lying is not a good thing and that it's not acceptable in the community, I think the punishment here did not quite seem to fit the crime. I want to go back and ask Peter, can't they just be ostracized from the community? Or can you just, in some way push them outside because they didn't share the ethics of the community? It seems to me that my way or the highway approach to ministry would have been off-putting, but the church continued to grow. So I think there's something more to this story than simply not lying. Right? I think that their story helps us to better understand, perhaps, what it meant to be together and on one accord. That is, as the writer says, to have one heart and one soul. What I quickly learned is that being a part of that community meant sharing the same ethos and values. And one of those values was being honest, right? It was truth-telling. While we tend to focus on their actions and the punishment that they received, I want to highlight that it's also in this story that we find the word church for the first time. In all of Luke Acts, it's here in Acts 5:11 that we read, and great fear seized the whole church, rightfully so, after they had heard all of these things which had happened. The whole church. So how did this community of believers, who we're calling brothers and sisters, become the church? The ecclesia, right? The Greek word for church. That word is translated assembly or gathering often, but the etymology of that word, ek, means out of, and kaleo means to call, right? So to be called out is another potential meaning of ecclesia. What if the lesson that we learn here is not about lying? What if the lesson is that we are called out to be different from those who exist around us? What if we are called out of normative practices, right? It's normal to not talk about money, to not fully disclose when we're asked things. That's considered a normative practice. What if we're called out to be different in community? In spite of the situation, great numbers of men and women were added to the believers. So what is it that we've learned from the Acts of the Apostles? What can this first church teach us? I think that it teaches us that there's a different way of being in community. One way that results in folks devoting themselves to hanging out together, to being together both inside the temple and outside of the temple. A way that believers can become friends in the deepest sense of that word. And that friendship then leads to us sharing with gladness and with a generous heart. And then finally, perhaps there's a community that can foster trust that goes beyond our fear, because it's often fear that keeps us from sharing freely. That's not an exhaustive list, and I would invite you to continue to think about what you would add Togetherness is more than simply sharing space, and these stories remind me of how we form community is just an important consideration of the rules of engagement within that community. How we care for each other and our ability to trust one another can be both life-giving and life-changing. And before I move to my second and last example, I'm feeling confessional again. I am the daughter of a Free Will Baptist minister. And as a preacher's kid, my dad was in ministry for almost 40 years. Many of those years he was a pastor. So my ideas of stewardship is very much influenced and informed by those experiences. I am keenly aware that the building has to operate. But I also know that there is so much more to the church than just that building. And one of my very early memories of my dad's ministry was a time when we went to a small country church. And I'm a small country girl. And there was no air conditioning in the church. I remember that because it was the summer in North Carolina and it was very hot. And we were fanning. I don't remember what my dad's sermon was that evening. But I do remember how the church chose to honor him in his service. They pounded him. This is what they called it, pounding. No, that wasn't punching on him. The sermon wasn't that bad, for those of you who might be thinking that. And for some others who are thinking about the handshake, that's not what it was either. What they did was that they gave our family a pound of sugar and a pound of peas, a pound of rice and a pound of beans, a pound of flour. It was the most sincere expression of appreciation that I had experienced. The congregation gave what they had to give, and it was beautiful, and we accepted it in the spirit in which it was given to us with glad hearts. My parents told us on our drive home that, this was the old-fashioned way that they used to pay preachers, right? And so for me, the old-fashioned way was like, the days of slavery? I mean, when did this happen, right? And so it harkened back to the early church. And so I began my second example of the African American church. And really with the question of, so how did an enslaved people establish churches? They had no resources. How did they do that? Well, the story of the AME Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, is that it was founded as a clearing in Delaware in 1787, 1787, by Richard Allen. He was an enslaved man who had been separated from his family as part of the slave trade, but he took solace in God's love. And so eventually Richard Allen purchased his own freedom and had this religious awakening, and in response to the inhumanities of slavery, wanted to establish the first AME church. But what Richard Allen envisioned with Mother Bethel, the name of the church, was not simply a spiritual escape for enslaved people. He wanted the church to be a vehicle for self-help. So historically, Black churches were not simply responsible for meeting the spiritual needs of their people, but also they attended to their psychological, financial, educational, and very basic human needs, right? The food, the pounding. According to James A. Joseph, the author of Black Philanthropy, he says that African Americans connect to the Black church directly is linked to an overriding belief that their service to God is linked to the service of humanity. So in other words, they saw giving to each other as the same as giving to God. In the early days of the Black church, services were often held outside until the congregation grew large enough for them to build the wood and brick structures. These structures were built with their very hands, and so you see the church belonged to them just as much as they belonged to the church. The church was not simply that physical building. It was the community of believers who attended to the needs of each other, and not just the spiritual needs. The Mission Fund was one of these ways they supported each other. And the Mission Fund was not about sending people to faraway lands, but it was about demonstrating God's love in their very own neighborhoods. There was an overarching understanding that the support and care of the physical place where people chose to gather should never supersede the recognition of people's humanity, an acknowledgement and provision of their very basic needs for survival. The church was and remains a meeting place, but it's also so much more. It provides moral and spiritual and political leadership and support. The church is a guide and a beacon, but times have changed, and after the civil rights movement, Black church attendance declined. However, studies have also found that during times of illness, the informal financial support and spiritual support and caregiving assistance offered by African American churches is second only to the support provided by the actual family. So while the structure of the church might have changed and the people who actually go in it may have changed, it seems that what the people need from the church has not. What can we learn from this example? Come talk with me afterwards and we will discuss that. But what I would like to conclude with is the understanding of stewardship as a symbiotic relationship. That is, we need each other to survive. These two examples may not work in our current context or your particular context because life is different today than it was in the first century and even different than it was in the 1800s and 1900s. However, I hope these examples can provide us ways of beginning to rethink about stewardship, to reimagine what it means to think of our parishioners more holistically. Although I tend to agree with the songwriter that we can't beat God's giving, I think we should give it a try, right? Because it enables us to further the work of God. It enables us to live together in community with one heart and one soul. And then that way we can move from this idea of a mission offering to perhaps mission possible or mission accomplished. Thank you.